Welcome to Capital Catch-Up, your in-depth guide to the latest legislative developments in Washington. I am Victor.
And I am Leanie. Today we are diving deep into a wide array of bills, focusing on how these proposed laws could impact everyday Americans, while also looking at some of the complex procedures Congress uses to shape policy. Let us start with national security and how it intersects with the global economy.
That is right, Leanie. First up is Senate Bill 5316, also known as the Biotech Investment National Security Act of 2026, or the BINSA Act. This bill addresses national security concerns regarding the transfer of United States capital and pharmaceutical innovation to the People's Republic of China. It seeks to amend the Defense Production Act of 1950 by classifying biotechnology, including pharmaceutical development, biologics manufacturing, and clinical research, as a prohibited or notifiable technology.
This classification would subject biotechnology to much stricter outbound investment screening. Proponents of the BINSA Act argue that current investment flows create strategic dependencies and accelerate China's dominance in the global pharmaceutical supply chain. For everyday Americans, this could ultimately affect the security of our domestic drug supply. The legislation mandates that the Secretary of the Treasury define the specific parameters of this biotechnology sector through rulemaking, and it requires the Secretary of Defense to submit a report assessing the impact of these capital flows on U.S. national security and military readiness.
This ties into another major national security effort on the House side, House Resolution 7688, which is the DPA Modernization Act of 2026. This bill seeks to update and reauthorize that same Defense Production Act of 1950 to better align federal industrial capacity with modern national security and economic needs. It introduces significant structural reforms, including the establishment of a critical minerals resilience initiative to reduce reliance on foreign adversaries for strategic materials.
It also implements stricter oversight for government equity investments in private entities. It clarifies the scope of presidential authority by requiring that emergency powers be tied to specific declared emergencies, while simultaneously granting federal agencies greater flexibility to waive regulations to expedite the procurement of critical technologies and infrastructure. Furthermore, the legislation emphasizes workforce development by allowing financial assistance to be used for training in defense-critical occupations, which could open up new job opportunities for American workers. It also mandates increased reporting requirements to ensure transparency and fiscal accountability in the management of the Defense Production Act Fund.
Speaking of fiscal accountability, Congress has been working on funding the Department of Homeland Security for the 2026 fiscal year. We have three related bills here: House Resolution 7147, House Resolution 4213, and House Resolution 7744. These bills highlight the complex process of federal appropriations.
Let us start with House Resolution 7147, the Homeland Security and Further Additional Continuing Appropriations Act, 2026. This is a continuing appropriations bill, which is a procedural tool Congress uses to keep agencies funded and operating. This specific act provides funding for the Department of Homeland Security, focusing on management, intelligence, oversight, and operational support. It mandates strict financial accountability, requiring the Secretary to submit detailed budget and staffing reports, oversee acquisition programs, and adhere to rigorous reporting requirements for new pilot projects. It also includes specific provisions for body-worn cameras for enforcement agents and emphasizes the role of the Inspector General in auditing to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. However, it explicitly restricts funding for certain border security and immigration enforcement operations by setting those specific budget allocations to zero.
Meanwhile, House Resolution 4213 and House Resolution 7744 are both titled the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act, 2026. House Resolution 4213 outlines the federal funding allocations and administrative requirements for agencies like U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Transportation Security Administration, and the Coast Guard. It provides significant financial resources for operations, procurement, construction, and research, but also imposes strict oversight measures such as mandatory monthly budget reporting and detailed briefings on acquisition programs. It even establishes specific conditions for the release of funds including requiring the Secretary to provide comprehensive responses to congressional inquiries.
And House Resolution 7744 is very similar, outlining funding allocations and operational mandates for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2026. It funds major enforcement agencies, including Customs and Border Protection and ICE, and emphasizes transparency. It mandates detailed monthly staffing and budget reporting, strict protocols for new pilot programs, and comprehensive acquisition oversight. Like House Resolution 7147, it includes specific provisions for body-worn cameras for enforcement agents and establishes clear administrative procedures for transferring funds and reporting non-competitive contracts to improve operational efficiency.
Now let us pivot to transportation and a legislative concept called preemption. We have two identical bills, Senate Bill 1779 and House Resolution 3194, both known as the Locomotives Act. These bills seek to amend the Clean Air Act to preempt state-level authority regarding emission standards for existing locomotives and their engines.
Preemption is a legal doctrine where federal law takes precedence over state law. Under these bills, states would be explicitly prohibited from setting or enforcing their own regulations on existing locomotive engines when used in common carrier railroad transportation engaged in interstate commerce. The primary purpose is to establish a uniform federal regulatory framework, reducing regulatory fragmentation and alleviating potential operational burdens on the railroad industry. Proponents prioritize national consistency in transportation commerce over individual state environmental mandates.
Moving on to election administration. Senate Bill 5355 is the Ballots by Election Day Act. Introduced in the Senate on August 6, 2026, it proposes an amendment to the Help America Vote Act of 2002 to establish a uniform federal deadline for the receipt of mail-in and absentee ballots.
This bill mandates that, for all federal elections held from 2027 onward, mail-in and absentee ballots must be received by election officials no later than the time polls close on Election Day to be considered valid for tabulation. While it seeks to standardize election procedures across the country, it includes a specific exemption for ballots cast by military personnel and overseas voters, ensuring that existing protections for those populations remain in place. The bill has been referred to the Committee on Rules and Administration for further consideration.
Congress is also looking outward to support democracy and human rights abroad. Senate Bill 5369, the Restoring Electoral Fairness and Opposition Rights Through Mandates for Accountability Act of 2026, seeks to reauthorize and expand U.S. sanctions against the Nicaraguan government in response to the authoritarian consolidation of power by Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo.
Citing systematic corruption, human rights abuses, the suppression of religious and civil society organizations, and the abandonment of competitive elections, the bill mandates the extension of the Nicaragua Investment Conditionality Act of 2018 through 2035. Key provisions include expanding sanctions to target Nicaragua's gold sector, penalizing the persecution of religious and political figures, and sanctioning entities that support the governments of Russia or Iran. It also requires regular reports on sanction implementation and an assessment of the conditions necessary for a democratic transition in Nicaragua.
Similarly, Senate Bill 5370, the Combating the Persecution of Religious Groups in the People's Republic of China Act, establishes a formal U.S. policy to hold Chinese officials accountable for severe human rights abuses against religious and ethnic minorities, including Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, Uyghur Muslims, and Falun Gong practitioners. It mandates evaluating these officials for potential sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act and directs the Department of State to prioritize programming that monitors and promotes religious freedom, requiring annual briefings to Congress.
Now let us turn to domestic policies that directly affect American communities. First, for our agricultural workforce, Senate Bill 5301, the Voice for Farm Workers Act, was introduced to reauthorize and significantly expand the role of the Department of Agriculture's Farm Worker Coordinator through 2031. It aims to strengthen support for the agricultural workforce by broadening the coordinator's mandate to include enhanced collaboration with educational institutions and community organizations, developing comprehensive outreach plans, and evaluating federal program effectiveness to bolster rural economic resilience.
For college students, Senate Bill 3589, the RISE Act, aims to improve the higher education experience for students with disabilities by streamlining the process for obtaining academic accommodations. The bill mandates that colleges accept various forms of existing documentation, such as high school IEPs, 504 plans, or records from licensed professionals, as sufficient proof of disability. This reduces administrative barriers for students. It also authorizes $10 million in funding for the National Center for Information and Technical Support for Post-Secondary Students with Disabilities through 2031 and requires colleges to report enrollment and graduation rates of students with disabilities, while maintaining protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act.
There's also House Resolution 9250, the Great American Outdoors Act 250. This legislative proposal aims to modernize and maintain critical infrastructure across the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and the Bureau of Indian Education in anticipation of America's 250th anniversary. It establishes the America's Legacy Restoration Fund, financed through energy development revenues, donations, and other sources, to address priority deferred maintenance projects, enhancing public access and safety on public lands and at educational facilities.
For public safety in federal workspaces, Senate Bill 2542, the Federal Building Threat Notification Act, mandates that the Director of the Federal Protective Service develop and implement standardized emergency communication protocols for federal buildings within 1 year. This requires that building tenants be promptly notified of violent threats, including firearm incidents, terrorism, or suspicious materials occurring within or near their facilities, without requiring additional federal appropriations.
And on a very local level, Senate Bill 4505 is a legislative proposal that mandates the United States Postal Service to establish unique, dedicated zip codes for a specific list of 83 communities across various states within 1 year. This bill, reported with an amendment by the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, aims to improve postal identification and address localized concerns regarding mail delivery and geographic identity.
Finally, let us take a quick look at the administrative side of Congress. The Congressional Record, Volume 172, Number 132, from August 13, 2026, shows that the day's proceedings were primarily administrative. It began with a prayer for unity and grace, the approval of the previous day's journal, and the Pledge of Allegiance. The House received various executive communications, including regulatory updates from the Environmental Protection Agency, reports on healthcare and workforce programs, and notifications regarding national emergencies. Members also introduced a broad slate of new legislation covering credit union investment authority, cancer research funding, housing affordability, and District of Columbia governance, before adjourning until August 17, 2026.
As we close out today's episode, what should our listeners be watching out for, Victor?
Listeners should keep an eye on how the Treasury Department begins defining the parameters for biotechnology investments under Senate Bill 5316 and watch the progress of the Department of Homeland Security appropriations bills as Congress continues to debate funding and policy restrictions.
That is all for today's Capital Catch-Up. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Goodbye.